Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life.
What is going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to the 817 podcast, where we talk about the lovely city of Fort Worth, Texas. We get into politics, business, culture, news. If it impacts you as a Fort Worthian, we discuss it. If you have not heard our last two episodes with Anthony Johnson's sisters or with our Fort Worth ISD teacher who came on to share her experience, I highly recommend you do that because that was probably my favorite week, Ann, in doing the show with you.
Yeah, I had lots of people reaching out to me that listened to those episodes and were really moved and impacted by it. In fact, I just got a message on Facebook Messenger from somebody that listened to the one with the school teacher and was like, "Oh, do you think that the school board representative for the district that I live in listens to your pod?" So I guess maybe I'll suggest to him that he suggests to her that she tune in.
Yeah. I think it feels like we're doing a lot of great change, and I think this episode that we have another interview with a guy that we interviewed in the past, who is one of the co-founders of the Tarrant for Change, which is a for-profit really helping community grassroots organizations to get more of a voice and to stand up. And I think a lot of things you're seeing at Tarrant County, from Cesar Chavez holiday to this campus voting locations, to the LGBTQ proclamation stuff at the city. This guest is super involved in making sure voices are heard in the right rooms. And honestly, his last episode with us was one of the top 5 episodes we've had. So we also feel it's like something you guys really want to dissect. And the last title of his last pod was how Tarrant County is the epicenter of extremism. And so now we're titling this one as who is winning the battle of extremism in Tarrant County.
And he came on to give us a extremism weather report. I thought that was a cool analogy. One clarification, nonprofit, his organization, I think you said for-profit. So
yes, you are correct. Tarrant for Change is a nonprofit, but his kind of consulting work, where he helps diverse communities through social entrepreneurship, leadership development, business consulting, and nonprofit support, that is a for-profit. But really, I just see Alexander Montalvo as a community organizer and just a true strategist and architect of the landscape. His experience just shows when you hear him talk. And I just always enjoy getting his perspective on things.
Yep, we went down a lot of paths today, talked about a lot of different things. I was hoping to end up with some call to action because I think that's always helpful. I don't want to discourage people. And sometimes the things that we're talking about, especially when we're talking about these extreme positions that some folks are taking in our community and the impacts that that extremism has on our community, can be frustrating and make us feel like throwing our hands up and not doing anything. But I don't think that that's what the takeaway from this interview is. I think that there's a lot of highlights of work that they're doing and a call to action to support the type of work that they're doing in the community.
100%. So here is Alexander Montalvo. Alrighty, so we have a part 2 conversation with Alexander Montalvo, and it's really exciting to have him here because last time you were here, we talked about how Tarrant County is the epicenter of extremism for the United States. And a lot has happened since we had that conversation. And for those of you who may not be aware, it's one of our top 5 episodes we've had in the 817 podcast. So with all that's going on in Tarrant County, all the things we've discussed, from DEI to banning books, or the LGBTQ badge, or the proclamation, there's just the list goes on. And so Alexander, welcome back to the pod. We won't ask for your Fort Worth story because we heard it last time, but we'll love to ask you, what is your synopsis or analyzation of Fort Worth today and Tarrant County as we get ready for a November election? But then also, it just feels like there's been a lot of organizing and things in the news that you've been also seeing.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here with both of y'all. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I'm happy to give the extremism weather report to share that extremism in Tarrant County, almost a year later since our conversation, which was also with Lydia Faith, which is a great conversation. Extremism in Tarrant County is alive and well, and so the winds of extremism are definitely still strong in Tarrant County. We're seeing this in a number of different ways, the examples you gave, and so many others. And I think what's really important for people to understand is how this culture of far right extremism, of Christian nationalism, has, and how deep it's kind of gotten into our county, is something that we need to continue to be aware of. Now, we're seeing progress in how we're fighting some of that stuff, but at the end of the day, the people that have positions of power, that have influence over major buckets of money and resources within our city, our cities within Tarrant County and the county itself, and then those who represent us at the state legislature, are still very much extreme, and they have an agenda that they are continuing to pursue. And we need to stay vigilant. We need to be able to stay informed, because the good news of this, unfortunate weather report of extremism is that we actually have the numbers. Yeah. We actually have the ability. We actually have the collective opportunity to really dismantle this extremism and lean into a much more inclusive, equitable society that I know the three of us are all aspiring to see within Fort Worth and Tarrant County.
Could you really quickly give us also just an update on your organization and what it is, Tarrant for Change?
Yeah, so Tarrant for Change is one of the organizations I've helped co-found here in Tarrant County. I shared last time that I started my own company, the Catalyst Project, and it's really focused on being able to help build the organizing infrastructure that we need within counties like Tarrant County, throughout Texas, and even outside of Texas. And so Tarrant for Change is a key component of that infrastructure, because the role that Tarrant for Change is providing within the county is to connect, collaborate, develop, and invest in grassroots organizing within the county. And that's really important because there is so much good work that's happening, but a lot of it is siloed. A lot of it is under-resourced, majorly under-resourced. And a lot of folks just are not running into each other because we're a county of 2.1 million people. Fort Worth alone is, right at 1 million people. And it takes a lot of work to make sure that people are informed of who's doing what and how they're doing it, how we can learn from each other, and just how we can collaborate. And so there's been a lot of great work being done throughout Tarrant County this past year. And I think, you can look at the Commissioner's Court as an example of how Tarrant for Change is playing a role, but so many other organizations are playing a role of intentionally building relationships, of intentionally communicating to be able to fight back against the things we're seeing from the County Commissioner's Court.
Yeah, I think that comment you made about all these different places working in silos is what resonates with me, because before we started, our official conversation this morning, I said, there's all these different organizations and I just don't know where to plug in. And EJ has said similar things in the past about, who's doing what and what is the Democratic Party doing here. And now we've had people on the pod that's kind of addressed that and told us a little bit about that. But it sounds like what your organization is doing is really what is that cohesive glue to kind of be aware of what all those things are and bring those things together. Yeah. Because I get every email that everybody sends and I'm like, who do I give money to? Who do I sign a petition for? Who do I go to a meeting and show up for? And it's a lot.
Yeah. There's a lot when it comes to grassroots organizing that people don't understand what that is and what it looks like. And there was a great report done after Obama's election that asked the question, is this a progressive moment or is this a progressive movement? And I think looking back, that was done in 2009 by the J. Marshall Law Review. This is, it was a moment, right? And even how progressive it is up for debate. But the thing that report did was talk about how organizing was put more into the mainstream conversation, but so many in America do not understand what organizing is and what it takes. And a lot of times people will allocate organizing to a political party or to an issue, but it is really about local based community organizing that has the intersectionality of all these things. And so when it comes to grassroots organizing, the kind of perspective we have, we look at it as, this is an industry that we're looking at, that we're trying to change what is happening within our communities and what future we want. And that industry includes work that's tied to mutual aid, tied to advocacy, tied to activism, and tied to electoral organizing. So when campaigns come around and you want to start getting out the vote, but it's not exclusively just elections. And I think that's one thing that gets missed from folks, because when we start talking about resource distribution within an industry, this particular industry is designed to be very extractive from our local communities. So they want to suck up resources, both dollars and talent, to be able to centralize into a national perspective and a national place. Or even a state like Texas, a statewide place. So you'll see a lot of money getting allocated to efforts that impact DC and the White House and Congress, or get pulled into Austin because of the Texas Capitol. But when we have a state our size and of 30 million people, and we have a county, Tarrant County, our size of 2.1 million people, Texas represents 10% of the electorate nationally, and Tarrant County is about 1% of that. And that's huge when you're thinking about a country of 330 million people. And I think we're getting to 170 million registered voters. We'll see after this election what that looks like. But when we look at the resources that are staying in Tarrant County for Tarrant County, we are completely under-resourced in comparison to what we need. And that makes a huge impact when it comes to why we have extremism in Tarrant County and why it's thriving and has thrived for so long in Tarrant County. We got to fix that distribution model to where it's not just resources being extracted from our community and our county and going to other places, but it's actually staying within our local communities and being led by local grassroots organizers, because that autonomy and that skill set and that perspective is what helps drive change. And when you look at any major change that's happened in our country, it has not been the establishment, it has not been the party. When you look at civil rights, when you look at women's suffrage, or when you look at all these different things, it came from local grassroots efforts that bubbled up and built that power to be able to drive that change. And that's what we got to cultivate here in Tarrant County.
And then also has that structure to it that is year round and all the time, instead of flaring up for elections. Because if you're just flaring up for elections, then you're not organized and don't have that resource to pull together. Or if you're only flaring up for a terrible thing that happens and then that peters out. Because I know, women's marches came around, Black Lives Matter marches came around, people got really invigorated. We saw a lot of people coming together, and then where did it go?
Yeah, we look at that as a wave of community activist advocacy emotion that happens. But once that wave crests, there's very few people who are still there in that work. Usually it's folks who have been directly impacted who will be there, and then folks who have the autonomy and the resources to probably be there, the privilege to be able to be there. But the community at large, we see these large gatherings, right? We see these large opportunities, of large amounts of people coming together, but we still are not understanding what that means to help build power. And when it comes to elections, I mean, there's so much money. There's so much money. I think the Harris Walz campaign is, getting close to $1 billion since she took over top of the ticket. I think we see how much that drives people's interest and theory of change for what they want to see in their communities and what they want to see in the country or the state. But really, once again, it comes down to the local community and the organizing that's happening. And when we look at elections, it's really presented as an advertising effort. It's a marketing campaign and effort that can lean into mobilization, which is getting the people out to participate in activity. But neither one of those are organizing, because organizing at its heart is about relationships. Organizing at its core is about understanding where these pockets of communities and influence reside so that you can then build that trust and you can build that momentum to work as a collective. And that takes time, that takes a lot of effort. And so it's not transactional. It's not about, hey, here's this thing, we need you to do XYZ and this will happen. And this is why people are so burnt out, because it's like, you've been selling this to me for decades and
That thing you promised never came.
It never came. 40% of Texans are still making under $15 an hour. So we see communities like Fort Worth and Dallas and Austin and Harris, having rates of, you need to make annual income of $121,000, $149,000 to afford a house. And we're fighting for minimum wage at $15 an hour. Hopefully we're going to get it higher, but MIT shows us the livable wage in Tarrant County is closer to $20 an hour. And so we have all these discrepancies in people being able to meet their day-to-day needs. And they're wondering, like, look, you came to me with this transaction to say if I participated in doing this one thing to vote or, signing this petition or doing this thing that things would change. And they haven't, because it's not just about mobilization. It's about organizing. It's about building power.
So one of the analogies always, like you brought up last time I saw you, was around like Rocky IV and that moment when you hit Drajo and he's bleeding or whatever. It feels like Tarrant County, the organizing of the establishment, is the Russian boxer in that movie. Can you tell me how big is the other opponent? If we're Rocky and we're preparing for this fight, and let's say we're the coaches and we have to get Rocky ready to fight him, what are we saying about the enemy?
Yeah, I love the Rocky IV analogy too, because there's no more grassroots than the way he trained in that movie, right?
Yeah.
Some wood, running through the snow and some mountains. Hey, keep it simple, right? So yeah, I think extremism, like I said at the beginning, is alive and well in Tarrant County, and they are moving money. And they are influence a lot of industries and relationships within our county, within our cities, to be able to try to achieve their goals. And if you listen to some of them, their goals are fucking crazy. Yeah. So you have Beau French, who wants to make Tarrant County inhospitable for any Democrat to live in this county, which is anti-American, anti-democratic, anti-human, essentially, because there's no world where that exists. But people don't realize that the Texas GOP itself has in their platform that they want to secede from the Union. They want Texas to be independent and a country unto its own. And so when you look at this Christian nationalism, extremism, and the people who are representing our communities, because they are elected officials now, and you hear things like Project 2025 that the Trump administration and the National Republican Party is after, there is a changing of our country, and especially a changing of Texas, that they are after, that people have not been taken seriously enough.
They always just go, oh my God, that's so crazy. That person is so crazy. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but they're actually moving in that direction and trying to accomplish that thing. So we need to stop being so shocked by how crazy it is.
And where, like, I sometimes say that to friends, like, I don't think it's off script that Texas can one day secede from the Union. Like, what's your take on that actually happening?
I see it very, very unlikely, just because of, I guess I still have some belief in the national infrastructure institutions that would need to be overridden for that to happen.
And the actual funding that they get from the federal government that would go away.
That's the annoying part about it, is the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, all that money's going in the red states. Texas is crushing on receiving those federal dollars to build this infrastructure. So but like, you think people look at the surplus, right? And they look at all the, like, now trying to take down the public school systems, and we're already on our independent electrical grid, however we feel that is going. But so I think a lot of people fear this.
But I want to speak to what you said, EJ, because while I don't think it's logistically legitimate, it feels legitimate. And I think that's really important to speak to, is that they are amassing a lot of influence. They have a lot of money behind them. Texas Monthly did a great job of breaking down the influence of Midland oil billionaires like Tim Dunn and others. And so grassroots organizers were talking about that, also from their own publications to try to bring awareness to folks about that. But so there's a lot of money interest. There's a lot of things that are driving this. But at the end of the day, we have these mechanisms in place of building local power that can offset, because there are limitations to how effective that money can be. You look at examples of hundreds of thousands of dollars being put towards local elections and being defeated by candidates who had tens of thousands of dollars, right? Or those hundreds of thousands of dollars in school board races win, but they only win by a couple hundred votes or maybe 1,000 votes that has an electorate pool of tens of thousands available. And so all their money is showing us that, yes, they can get to they can overcome this hurdle, but they're barely overcoming it. So what's the antidote to all of that? It's organizing. It's building trust. It's building relationships. And it's building a collective that can work together to push back against this. And in the American spirit of individualism, there's a lot of people who are getting trapped by that perspective that the far-right Republicans are giving, because at the end of the day, individually, we're all trying to pay the bills. We're all trying to put food on the table. We're all trying to put a roof over our head. And so when you're so focused on trying to do that, you can get lost in some of these narratives and some of these political bubbles.
Sound bites, easier message, no need for explanation. People just kind of bite on it, hook, line, and sinker.
But when you talk to people, when you really build relationships with people, they're pissed off about a whole lot of things that the majority are pissed off. And when you look at how Americans in Texas are feeling on a number of issues, they feel much more progressive about issues than what our representation is saying. But once again, that is the deficit that we have when it comes to organizing, and how in Texas, and especially in Tarrant County, we think about change. So we have a 30-year playbook in Texas that is focused on looking at the active electorate, the active voters, which means it's more largely white voters. And how can we convince them to vote for the things that we're trying to push for, that are going to be more inclusive, that are going to be more equitable, that are going to be focused on people's rights. And we focus on messaging that is not going to be effective for them, but it also is not effective for the diverse base, because they are not going to be enthusiastic about the watered down messaging you're doing to try to convince those folks. So the theory of change from a grassroots organizer's perspective is looking at the electorate and saying, okay, there's millions who are registered who aren't voting, and there's millions who can register to vote that aren't registered. That population, that collective is very diverse. And if we focus on building trust and relationships in those spaces, we have more than enough numbers to win not only local races, but statewide races. And Tarrant County is at the center of all of that.
You know, it's crazy. So before I ran for office, I had not ever really talked to campaign consultants or, I was a lifelong voter, but I didn't know like how it works. But what you just said totally resonates with what drove me insane. And that was, you got a list of people who voted. You could see which primaries they voted in, and you'd go knock on those doors, and you would walk past door after door after door where they were not on the list. And I was like, I want to talk to all these people. I want to convince all of these people that I am wanting this job for the right reasons, because I am all about community and all of that. And it was like, no, you don't have time for that. You just got to go knock on the doors of these people that vote. So what you just said about ways to communicate and get to people that are not being tapped resonates with me like crazy. And it's that grassroots organizing. I mean, I came from Quaker upbringing where we were doing all that kind of stuff. as a kid, but I never did it as an adult necessarily. And then just kind of plugged in to community here and went along with how things had been done up to this point.
Yeah, and that's a part of how the electoral cycles are contributing to the fragmentation of our communities, because we have, political consultants that are analyzing this data and thinking about, okay, what's the number to win based on the data available, but you're not looking at the people, right? You're not understanding the dynamics of the communities. You're not looking at the way people are in relationship with each other. And so you take out the humanity in this part. You put a lot of money into this, and this is where you'll justify saying, well, let's pay $10,000 to advertise on social media to young people to get them excited about voting, and then not understanding that your message is not resonating with them at all. They're not even going to pay attention to it, or you're going to spend hundreds of $1,000s on mailers, and how many of those are just going to go to the trash? I mean, I'm very active in the community. I'm very active in grassroots organizing. I'm definitely very active in the political space. And I'll get those mailers and
I do the exact opposite. I keep them all until the end of the campaign. I stack them up by category of who they came from. And we get mailers from both sides because of some voting history in my household that is not me. And yeah, but I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to that kind of stuff.
But how much of those flyers are influencing your decision?
No, I mean, they either kind of affirm what I already know, right, or, but sometimes make me go do a little bit more research to find out where the heck did that come from. Because, some of those little sound bites that they put on those things are insane.
But how much more action do you take when a colleague comes to you to talk about an issue, to inform you, and then to bring you to a meeting to then talk about what's going on?
Yeah, that's much more important,
right?
Much
and
more
that's that juxtaposition.
I feel like that's also a lot why you're really big in the North Side stuff, because if Annette and the Hispanic Chamber, but I feel like you've been really involved in that, but that's kind of like your work.
Even before all that started, because we, some of the people on Community Design Fort Worth's board looked at what the focus was with Panther Island and with the stockyards, and saw Northside basically not being represented at all. And what does Northside think of all of this, and how are they concerned about how it could negatively impact their community? So we started those conversations way before even the city was looking at what do we change about what we're doing on Panther Island, and the ULI group coming in to talk about, let's engage Northside. We'd already kind of started that, but in order to not have that fragmentation of multiple groups coming at a community all at once, asking a bunch of questions and adding to that distrust and that feeling of just another group coming to talk to me and then not going to deliver anything, we pulled back on our engagement and said, let's try to bring all these different various silos together and move forward.
And I know your work's a lot more in the urban design and the planning, but to me, it's like that's the part where I have a hard time even what would be y'all's landscape of looking at Fort Worth's Republican Party, because yes, you have the Tim O'Hare and this white nationalist kind of energy, but there also seems a lot of fragmentation, not just in Tarrant County, but at the state level. And I would say it's this corporate Republican, and then you have this Christian nationalist Republican, and it seems to be some infighting in those spaces where it impacts economics of communities, but then also rights of all people. How do you guys see that dance between what's happening in the Republican Party?
Yeah, so I think a lot of your listeners may have this history, but just to kind of take a step back, there's been a constant criticism within our communities, within Tarrant County, within Fort Worth especially, that we refer to as the Fort Worth Way, right? So when I'm talking about grassroots organizing and building relationships and building trust, in some ways people can say, well, that's the Fort Worth Way. We all know each other and this is how we leverage. But the Fort Worth Way is established on a certain class and a certain establishment of folks that are having those conversations. It's not having those conversations with the people,
everybody, with
the communities, right?
Yep.
And with the poor and working class within our communities, right? And so that's a huge deficit that they have from that lens. And this is why people are so critical of it, because it's them sitting, at the top of the heap in this bubble, to talk about things. And so you have this history of the Fort Worth way of where it's a more centralized conversation amongst a certain amount of folks to be able to talk about the direction of the city, to talk about the direction of even the county. And then you have this extremism arm that came from Trump's election in 2016. That, you know what, actually, I'm taking a step back on that. It actually came from Obama's election because the Tea Party was founded here in Tarrant County, and that's what kind of laid the groundwork to get us towards the Trump election and go beyond that. And so you had this extremism arm that was starting to grow to challenge the establishment as a whole, right? The establishment in Fort Worth and Tarrant County as a whole. And now you're seeing those fights play out. But it really is two different classes, two different components of the privileged class that are fighting against each other on the Republican side of where their values sit, you know, and where their desires are. And I think that's a big thing that people aren't realizing, that as moderate as some of these Republicans are perceived, and as the corporate Republicans as we may see them, they have a long history of not meeting the needs of the public at large. We have a large amount of inequities when you look at East Fort Worth. You look at other parts of Fort Worth.
Oh, yeah.
You have the systemic racism that has been a part of our history for a long time. And so while they don't seem as extreme as the new wave of extremism, we had problems with this establishment either way.
I think two things in that. Going back to the original idea of what the Fort Worth Way was, I think that people who came up with that terminology felt defensive when people started to kind of come at them and say that it wasn't good, because they thought it was like, oh, we all know each other, we get along, we invite everyone to the table. And in the beginning, there was a little bit of inviting some people from the table from underserved communities, but then very much with guidelines and buffers about how far you can go. And
it becomes a tokenized
exactly.
invitation and representation.
But that defensiveness existed all the way through. So every time anybody would be critical of it, they would be like, no, our idea was that was a very positive thing. But it's clear, everybody can see now why that wasn't such a positive thing. And then now, with the pushback that anybody who does speak up, that's one of the more moderate positions, and the actual attacking that comes at them from that side, I think they justify not speaking up by saying, well, I'm in this role and I can make some incremental change here if I don't put a full-blown target on myself by completely taking this really extreme group on. And I think that what we're seeing is that's not really working. And so you do need to shift over to what are your true beliefs of what it is that you want to try to accomplish here, and not just that desire to stay in power where you're kind of being ineffective.
I mean, I think an example, and I'd be interested to hear your take about it, is you're seeing that right now with, right, the 4-1 vote for the keeping the college campuses on the early election sites. Then Maddie Parker giving praise to Manny Ramirez for pitting, I guess, democracy before party. You also have Glenn Whitley come out saying he's going to vote for Patrick Moses and a few other Democrats. How are you interpreting those things? Like, do you see that as, like, when you say organizing and when you say we have the numbers, are you thinking about these corporate Republicans as coming together? Or when you say organizing, I actually think I'm just talking about we need to figure out the Democratic Party, which I also know there's challenges, because I totally think something you and I agree about. It's two elite classes, the hyper-educated Democrats and the hyper-capitalist Republican classes that really run those two parties. But I'm interested to hear, when you say organizing, who do you think needs to be working together?
Yeah, so I think a big part of this is how the establishment is trying to figure this out. So traditionally, and this is not completely unique to Tarrant County and Fort Worth. This is any major city, any major community, is that you start to pull your leadership from your managerial and executive class of folks within various industry, institutions, and things like that. And so this is why people coalesce around chambers. This is why people coalesce around their higher education institution, why they coalesce around, neighborhood associations, because these are all different pockets of this privilege that this managerial and executive class reside in, right? That detachment from the real community is already problem number one and has existed for decades, right? So that's not anything new in terms of why do we have the inequities that we have in society? Why are we not cultivating as much as we could from our community members? Because that class division has already happened. Now, within that class division, like you said, it goes into different political spaces, right? In terms of where they think their ideals are. Some may feel like they're trying to do better on behalf of community, but at the end of the day, if you're already in a privileged perspective and you stay within that privileged bubble and you're detached from the community at large, you're already working at this from a perspective that is not going to be adequate when it comes to the community. And so I think it's important for people to understand, like, this is a big separation point within what happens within just American society, right? And definitely happening within Tarrant County. I think when we see that these victories are happening, where you're seeing, Republicans and Democrats actually vote together to not eliminate early voting sites at UTA campuses and things like that, it's tempting to think like, oh, are we starting to make some change? But we got to take a look at this and say, okay, hold on. Are we celebrating Republicans doing the bare minimum for democracy and acting like that was such a courageous thing? It actually pisses me off even more that it took so much effort for them to do the bare minimum, because you had someone like O'Hare as a county judge who's continuing to try to push his extreme agenda in any way he can. And for the most part, Manny Ramirez is going to be on that side of that extremist agenda and has been up to this point.
Well, he spelled that all out in his letter, all the
Yeah.
reasons why he is very conservative.
Right. And so there's a shift that's happening that is not tied to values. It's not tied to the commitment to democracy. It's tied to gauging the political wins, right? And right now, for some Republicans, some moderate or corporate Republicans, and even folks who have been on the extreme wing but trying to, expand their tent for maybe future office runs or whatever, they're looking at this real potential that Harris and Walz are going to win the presidential campaign. And they're looking at Ted Cruz being as vulnerable as he's been, even though Colin Allred is running a horrible campaign, in my opinion, that there is a slimmer of a chance that Texas could have a statewide victory for the Democrats, or just continue to inch closer that we've seen now from Beto in 2018 to Biden in 2020. There was this trajectory, took a little dip in 2022, also because of a horrible campaign by Beto as governor. But there's still this, it's out there. Ted Cruz has hated so much that it's a wild card, right? So I think you're seeing some Republicans navigating this space like Manny Ramirez and Matty Parker based on what they're seeing within the political winds. But let's not forget that when the political winds were more extreme, they were also leaning into that space, right? They were leaning into, banning LGBTQ badges for the summer reading program, which makes no sense. Or you even had Betsy Price, inviting Trump to come to Fort Worth, for the benefit of whatever. And extremism and cozying up to extremism was okay because that was the, atmosphere of the day. And now the atmosphere of the day may change politically, and so you're seeing them pivot. But you look at Matty Parker when she criticizes the district with the establishment collective, mostly establishment collective, that signed that letter. There was a couple of grassroots community members in there as well, but mostly establishment folks. She's also in articles talking about there can be room for education savings accounts, which equals vouchers and fully funding public education. And that's just false. And so they are almost representing a party, but having no real foundation of values of where they're at. And I think that is as dangerous as an extremist telling you how extreme they are, because that means these elected officials, and you have some of those on the Democratic side as well, that will just completely change based on the winds. They're more followers than they are actual leaders. And this is one of the reasons why Tarrant County struggles so much, because we actually shouldn't be struggling as much with this. We're the third largest county in Texas. We have an immense amount of diversity. And we see that when that diverse collective comes together, that they can win things like a Mansfield ISD school board race, or win advocacy efforts like stopping the removal of the Cesar Chavez holiday, or, fight for things like the Tarrant County jail deaths, like what you guys had with Janelle Johnson and Janelle and Chanel yesterday with Anthony Johnson Jr.'s death, murder. And so there's all these things that we can come as a collective to fight and win. But this all comes down back to organizing, right? This is how organizing helps us overcome these things. As these establishment folks are navigating their political spaces, they are not beholden to representing the community or fighting for the rights or fighting for inclusivity or fighting for equity in the ways that as progressives we are trying to elevate within our communities.
So what's your beef or feedback for the Texas or Tarrant Democratic setup here? Like, if you just looked at the Democratic side, what are we having to navigate, figure out more to be able to make more moves?
I think within the Democratic Party, there's a lot of assumptions that, as from a progressive perspective, let me say it this way. From a progressive perspective, I've had to fight both the extremism in the Republican Party and I don't want to call it extremism within the Democratic Party, but just the failed perspective and policies of things like, neoliberalism or this commitment to military intervention, or this commitment to national politics that also is not helpful for our local diverse communities, right? It's how we look at the economy. It's how, a commitment to the version of capitalism that we have right now. There's a lot of things that people may argue about and say, like, we're a capitalist economy. And then we hear from the right saying, oh, we don't want to be socialists or things like that. Although we have an immense amount of corporate socialism, right? But at the end of the day, let's just look at capitalism. Our version of capitalism right now is prioritizing the shareholder versus prioritizing the laborer. And if we can shift capitalism to focus on labor, and that our capitalism benefits those who do the labor, that would be a monumental shift in addressing a lot of these things, because then that starts affecting and prioritizing wages, that starts prioritizing unionization, that starts prioritizing a lot of things that can move us in the right direction. Does it solve everything? No. But I think within the Democratic Party, when you look at it from a national perspective, there's still all these issues with how they look at navigating our country, navigating the world. So when you whittle that down to Texas and you whittle that down to Tarrant County, Tarrant County has been used as really a mining expedition for Democratic establishment outside of Tarrant County. It's really around extracting the resources from Tarrant County and conceding this to Republicans, and now very much is being conceded to the far right, simply because it's not a priority from their perspectives. from a much larger statewide or national perspective. And this is why that cannot be our focus or our motivation, because there's 2.1 million people who live in this county, and there's a lot of people who are dealing with inequities, that are suffering, that are not able to thrive within our communities. And if the local Democratic Party is not going to be invested to offset this Republican and this far right extremism, then we're going to struggle with some of this pushback. Like, with all that said, though, I'm not saying that the Democratic Party itself in its current iteration is our salvation, because there's a lot of issues in terms of that perspective, that mentality as well. So as a progressive, I'm still trying to push for a space that does prioritize the progress of people, that does prioritize the working class, that does prioritize how we are impacting poor people in our communities, because solving those things from the bottom up is how we solve things for everyone.
I oftentimes feel that privileged class, right? Like, and I think you and I, when we get coffee or when we're out in the community, I oftentimes feel like the podcasts, where do we sit in this game? Because I think there's a lot of progressive people who would listen to this podcast and say, this is the establishment podcast of the Democratic side. But then I'll have the Democratic side, the Democratic Party, they'll hear me say something negative about them, and they're like, oh, that guy's the progressive side. And so I think you got a lot of people who hear these big words that you just kind of shared, right? And trying to figure out who they are and where they are in all of this. And then the privilege of, you're right, we're also not the working poor today, because we are able to schedule a Sunday every week to do a podcast in a nice studio to then edit to make change that way. So, and I love what you said about, like, it starts with the home associations, the universities, and all that. I mean, like, my home association, the great people, but it looks nothing like the real landscape or ecosystems of my neighborhood. So, like, I mean, I feel we all are privileged in some capacity in this room and identify to that section. So how do you feel like we, as people who probably listen to this broadcast, probably feel the same way? What can we do to have a better understanding, a better representation of the laborer, the working class, and the poor?
Yeah, so I think first it has to start off with a recognition that when we look at our government entities, when we look at our industries, when we look at our institutions, when we look at philanthropy, and when we look at nonprofit spaces, that collective are not guiding us to the future that we're wanting right now. And it doesn't mean that people aren't well-intentioned in those spaces trying to do good work. It doesn't mean that people haven't sacrificed a lot to try to make change in the ways that they can, but the results speak for themselves. We're at where we're at today in Tarrant County. We're at where we're at today in Texas, in our country. And Tarrant County has not produced change in ways that are helping us move forward. In fact, Tarrant County has been at the center of what is pushing us backwards, right? And so we have to first recognize that. And that in itself is a hurdle for a lot of people, maybe for a lot of your listeners of this podcast.
I think people get very defensive, like that thing I pointed out before. They feel like they're working really hard. And even I was a little defensive before we started recording when you said that you see me as part of the establishment, because I'm like, wait a minute. I tried to do a thing and the establishment really did not see me as part of the establishment. But I do see the privilege side, and I recognize, but I think what holds a lot of people back is that if they stick their head up and say, I want to acknowledge that and find a path forward of what I can do, they're scared they're going to get smacked down by people who have a very clear idea of what words you should say and what words you shouldn't say. And so they want to do it right, but they fear coming from that privileged place that they don't understand. They have not walked in those shoes. And so they're good intentions, like you said, but just don't know where to go.
I want us to be real, though. I think for a lot of people who don't stick their head up or or pull back on what they want to change, it all comes down to their bag, right? It comes down to their paycheck. How's it going to impact how they're providing for their family, or how's it going to impact the goals that they have financially for themselves? And when you have privileged people in our community who have resources and who have access and influence, prioritizing their individual economic opportunities and money, that's where you start to see that we are not as effective as we need to be within Tarrant County, because there is a larger majority that is struggling to make ends meet, that is struggling with the way these institutions are handling the support that they need. I mean, Janelle and Chanel last week talked about they did everything you're supposed to do, and it still resulted in the murder of their brother, right? And so when we don't have the courage to, I see our privilege and understand how to utilize it, and we just become widgets in an establishment that is driving us much more into this extreme space where rights are being taken away, where issues are not being addressed. I mean, this is why we can't solve things like your passion, which is public transit, right? I mean, we should be on the forefront of being able to solve these kind of things, and we can't even get to those conversations adequately.
Because there's a lot of people making money from the way it's being done now.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so,
but then there has to be like who steps up to the greedy concrete people, or and all the.
At some point, we got to.
At some point.
Then we point back always to these public-private partnerships that we think are so great at solving these things, but then it's everybody going out and starting a new nonprofit to address a thing without looking to see what other nonprofits are doing, and just adds to that ecosystem of scarcity where we're all going after the same grants, and then the grant people are constantly changing what they want to focus on based on what's the hot thing for the time. Yeah. And it's just not
so it's this cycle of never able to do enough, never able to be good enough, because you're navigating a rigged game that is designed not for us to succeed, for the benefit of people. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're fighting against.
And that is like the amount of apathy, if that's the right word, in the sense of the amount of people who just like, the game's just rigged, so I no longer care. I'm trying to retire, stuff enough stuff in the corner, and just not play the game anymore. And like, that's especially Gen Zers or the young kids, they're like this. So how do you deal with that too? Like this hope of this game is rigged. Why,
So this is step one: recognize as a problem, right?
Yeah.
First step solving any problem is recognizing that there is one, right? That's something 101 from somewhere, right? After that recognition, then we've got to be intentional. And we've got to start talking about resource allocation. Okay, if you are in a privileged position, if you're listening to this podcast, or you're talking to a colleague who's in a privileged position and they don't feel like they are in a position to be able to put their hand up, put their head up, to stand up and fight against, then you got to outsource that to somebody. If you're not going to do it in your privileged position and you have resources, then you got to support somebody else who can or is willing to do that, right? And so every progressive movement that we've seen has come from the people, right? A lot of people from the bottom sacrifice to push against this establishment, to push against the things that are oppressing them. But at the same time, there are people who allocate resources to keep them going, to help make it happen. That includes, so we have this idea that movement work is just people putting in that good old-fashioned elbow grease and making it happen against all odds. It's a David versus Goliath type
pulling
thing.
themselves up by their own bootstraps.
Right. And there is a lot of sacrifice that is done by people who are impacted, but there also are resources that are allocated. You can go into the history of the civil rights movement, you can go in the history of all these things. There was resources allocated. Not enough, of course, but there were resources to get them to a certain point, okay? So if you are in a privileged position, allocate those resources to groups and organizations that are going to do something. And I love, Ann, that you brought up these different nonprofits that are cozying up to philanthropy and foundations that are supposed to do this thing. When we talk about infrastructure, the establishment builds a lot of infrastructure for themselves. So many may not know or may not remember, but Maddie Parker was the chief of staff for Mayor Price.
And the whole entire city council. She was my chief of staff as well. I know it
So-
always goes back to the mayor, but
When she announced her campaign, she did not announce her campaign as the chief of staff of Mayor Price. She announced her campaign as the executive director of T3 or Cradle to Career or whatever they've called it, right? A nonprofit was built that she transitioned to before running to office. So when we talk about infrastructure and we talk about having organizations to be able to transition within the spaces, the privileged establishment do this all day, and they'll take a lot of resources just to be able to navigate certain things like that.
you know, it's interesting that perspective of that, because from a person who was on the council at the time, that some of those initiatives were started by the mayor at the time, blue zones, all of that, and spinning them off into nonprofits is a way of making sure that those initiatives continue even after your time on being in elected office. Because if you leave them in the city, then other electeds are going to come in with their priorities and may cut the budget for that and make it go to something else. And so that I saw it literally as a way to continue that initiative. But to your point, it's coming from that perspective of a privileged person who's setting up something
It's also
to
setting up
continue
your
and
network.
And
to
giving
be in
jobs
positions
to
of
people.
power.
Yeah, and your policies to
Yeah.
continue to push forward. Like,
Yeah.
what is your, a lot of, I think listeners, there's a subset of listeners who love my Visit Fort Worth. Cowboy culture is a way for the Republicans to sell Republicanism. But then there's a lot of like very proud Hispanics who are also still in cowboy culture. And I know that's not the case for cowboy culture outside of Tarrant County, but they're like, can you please stop saying Cowboys is Republican or whatever? Because I think Visit Fort Worth is an example of that. And I don't think Visit Fort Worth, they knew or anyone thinks, but like in a way, it feels like a lot of money being spent to uplift a culture that is often identified with Republican people, right? The whole cowboy hats at Greg Abbott campaigns, Beethoven on a stage, no cowboy hats. Start getting wondery. I'm just interested, because I know you're a listener and you've heard me say that. What's your opinion on like how off am I on, or how much do you agree on that one?
Yeah, I think it's definitely
Like cowboy culture in Fort Worth.
I mean, if you look at the history of what Fort Worth was created as, and then, having the cattle drive and all that kind of stuff, the people who had the money to have those things and to be able to buy the land and how all that happened. Yeah, this is a generational passing of making sure that connection and that establishment kind of stays in place. But when you look at the data of how many people are moving to Tarrant County and Fort Worth from outside of Texas and the regions of the country that they're coming from, and then the amount of international folks that are coming to our county, and just the immense amount of diversity that's happening, it is an antiquated view of what Fort Worth is, and we want to keep this perspective and this marketing perspective of like, we're a small town, big city, and everything like that. But that is actually holding us back because we are not up to date with where the 21st century is.
the infrastructure needed for all those people.
We're thinking of 19th century, 20th century perspectives to market a city that we're now a quarter into the 21st century that is needing to address major issues for the future when it comes to climate, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, when it comes to all these things. And yeah, that marketing lens and that marketing perspective is holding us back, and it's keeping a lot of people out of the conversation because they're like, what the hell is this? Like,
Yeah, I'm not part of that.
I have no idea. I mean, like,
I kind of see it as the same as people think that in Australia everybody has a kangaroo.
Yeah.
In Texas or in Fort Worth, they think everybody has a horse.
Yeah.
But then they get here and they realize that's not really the case. But there's a shiny little place you can go over there and visit if you want to look at a longhorn.
Yeah, and I think I think the difference is like I don't know if Australia is pitting dollars to kangaroo propaganda to
don't know,
keep
wombats
to-
and
to- yeah,
kangaroos.
but are they like, yeah, like, oh, we're gonna make kangaroo mascot, and all the city officials are gonna wear a kangaroo on their suits? Like, it's just so much a part of it's like a red button to our economy. It's like, oh, more stockyards. Look at all those people, 20 million a year, and it's like, let's keep going, and we're just addicted to that economic model that the Cowboys bring us. But like you said, it's not real substantive stuff when we do have crazy substantive stuff happening in Alliance. I mean, Alliance is truly the first real manufacturing base shipping airport. I mean, it's the 5th biggest airport in Texas, and it doesn't ship people. I mean, it's a true beauty what's going up on there and the kind of logistics that's happening. Like, that's really here, but a lot of us don't even know about it. I mean, I have a kid next door to me who was salutatorian at Eastern Hills, went to UTA, got a engineering degree in semiconductors. And I was like, have you ever heard of Alliance? You should look at jobs there. And she goes, no. Like, it's like such like, she just graduated from UTA. Like, how does she not know about the Perot field and all that stuff? And, so it's just, there's so much going on in Fort Worth. And I was out at Down and Out with a city employee yesterday. And he was just saying, he's like, man, the issue is just none of us have any vision or cohesiveness at the city, because everyone is insecure of what Fort Worth is and what it isn't, and we don't really want to admit it and say we got to change, or we're trying to be something we're not. But it's like we really don't have a true understanding of all our collective assets and how to organize all of those collected assets to build a 21st century Fort Worth that looks way different than other cities because of how our structure is set up.
What an opportunity for a new city manager.
Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, this goes back to like when progressive minded folks have privilege, or when people who desire an inclusive and equitable society have privilege, if they're the ones who can't stand up to do things, to outsource it to folks on the ground who can help drive that change, right? In some ways, they are our collective, our leadership collective in Fort Worth and Tarrant County is outsourcing to the most privileged in our communities, whether it's the Basses or whether it's, other folks who have, the Pete and Charlie Guerin, or, Sid Richardson legacy, or whatever it is. Instead of having true collective leadership around the vision of what we want for our city and our county, we're simply just outsourcing this to the folks who have the most money to continue to drive the direction of how they see. And a lot of these folks are very old. Yeah. A lot of these folks are not connected to the future, are not connected. They're simply wanting to hold on, right? Yeah. And this is why they struggled with this extremism wing that came out of Tarrant County and didn't know how to combat it, because they're out of touch. And they didn't see this Christian nationalism movement that was being born right here in Tarrant County, and that was driving this stuff, and in some ways even supported it, even though now that they're saying that they don't agree with it, right? This is why this whole mess we have in Tarrant County is happening, because there is a middle class, an upper middle class that is more progressive, that they've got to start doing their part. They cannot just achieve.
And what does that look like? Because I would say I identify in that category.
It cannot just be about your individual achievement. It cannot
like you
just
say all the time, EJ. It's about the we, not the me.
Yeah. And
but like, I get asked for money every damn day. And I was like, and I have a baseline of like, this is how much I can give to an org if I got to give the 20.
And it's not just, when we talk about resources, it's not just about money, right? It's about, you and I have had conversations, make connections, and that has led to other conversations. And all that has been positive, right? But it's about the intentionality of what we're trying to build. What power are we trying to build? If you're simply trying to navigate the ecosystem
that
as a privileged progressive that already exists, you're going to get absorbed by it. It's just, that's what's going to happen. You're going to get absorbed by it. You're going to get compromised by it. And this is why when grassroots organizers are critical of organizations like the Hispanic Chamber, giving an award to Glenn Whitley a couple of years ago because he is going to say he's going to vote for Mike Collier against Dan Patrick for lieutenant governor. Like, that's the bare minimum a human should be doing, because Dan Patrick is a piece of shit, right? So, like, to then use a Hispanic Latino institution like the Chamber to give an award to someone like that because they're retiring, that's missing the mark, right?
Yeah.
And it's how we are compromising ourselves and our collective for this establishment that is not for us moving forward. And that's what we've got to do. That intentionality has got to be, that awareness has to be much more effective, and we have to make sure we're connecting. And so what organizations like Tarrant for Change and others are trying to show is like, look, there's a space where we are showing that change can happen, where we can fight against this stuff, but we're going to be limited in our scope based on the amount of resources or based on the amount of support and things like that. But you're seeing it from local community members who are deciding to run for office, who are connected to real community, winning races. You have other efforts that are happening where people are trying to build, economic opportunities that are locally based, that are being effective, that we should be supporting. It's about building a much better and diverse ecosystem is what our privileged progressive folks can do. Baseline voting, of course, tell people to vote, but that's that's the bare minimum. If we're talking about trying to build power, if we're talking about trying to change the power dynamics in Tarrant County, we've got to invest in it, and we've got to be connected, and we've got to be intentional, and
And you think the pod's doing that?
The pod is definitely a part of doing that. Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm, because I believe, like, I was not on Fort Worth's bingo card when EJ showed up and started doing this podcast. Like, they're like, where the hell this guy come from? He has, right? I have no, like, I got no money in Fort Worth. Not a single dollar comes from Fort Worth. I just live here. So I feel like I put a lot on the line every week. I say a lot of crazy stuff, right? I feel like,
go crazier, EJ.
Yeah, and you always want that's what you always are. And it's just like, but I feel like, but the pressure is, right, but maybe my wife does. Maybe my wife does. I'm not letting the pod know. But maybe my wife works in the city. Maybe, but then it's also, you do live here, and so you do see people. So it's like you're always kind of navigating, and then being a first generation wealth builder is also hard because, like, you do got to pay, like you said, you're everyone here is trying to pay the bills. And at the end of the day, like, you're trying to get your family right. So it's like, that's just what's so hard is that the labor class and working class, like, I see so many great, awesome people in my neighborhood, but the amount of time that they have, they got 2 kids that got to take the club soccer. They're going to watch 8 hours of that. Like, they have, like, they're not even aware of what we're talking about. And it's like, it's just so hard to, like, I feel like, to figure out what to do with someone with the privilege. I feel the power. I feel the privilege. But, like, how to manifest it correctly in a meaningful way is, I think, we struggle with.
I think that goes back to what I was saying about, you think you're doing it well and you're trying to do it, and then somebody tells you, no, that's not helpful. And I'm like, and it's a struggle to not get defensive and take that personally, because I think that from my perspective, everything I do is with the intention of doing good and helping people and building community. I mean, like, to my core, I came from living in a Quaker community where we made decisions together. We worked for the community. We were out doing things for the broader community that was outside our bubble. And I come from an absolute place of privilege. I mean, my grandparents worked incredibly hard to make sure that my parents didn't have any college debt. My parents worked really hard to make sure I didn't have any college debt. We worked really hard to make sure our kids could go through education without any college debt. So I very much literally come from that place of privilege. But I want to change that. And sometimes I feel like I'm being told, unless you come from the people that you're trying to help and have firsthand knowledge, you are unable to do that. And
maybe I would love, and this part can maybe not go in the pod depending on where this goes, but, like, I also think what's fascinating, Ann, is, like, I think I don't know how you would go through your political strategy again if you were doing it today compared to when you were doing it back then, because you very much took the nice approach of, like, hey, I'm going to stay out of it. I'm going to navigate it without knowing, like, you just always kept used the nice, maybe used the Fort Worth way that was more existence back when you kind of started in Fort Worth.
I don't
And
even think I really recognized
you
the
took a
Fort
nice
Worth
approach.
way. I came from my community and what I'd done there, building that to a broader community, and then I very much took the nonpartisanness of the seat that I was in to heart. And I could do that in the beginning. In 2014, there wasn't quite as much of that hostility of that. And I carried that through the entire time. And I got a lot of criticism for it because there were people who clearly knew that I was more progressive in my personal mindset, and I was not being a activist in my role. I was trying to do that incremental change, working within the establishment. And
The planner in you.
I went back and forth with people thinking that that was good and people that thinking that that was bad. And I had some 8-1 votes and some maybe 7-2 votes. And I had some success where I convinced people who maybe didn't want to do what I thought should be done.
Yeah.
So I don't think I would do it differently. When I ran for mayor, I clearly was not going to be the establishment's candidate. There was an establishment candidate when I made my announcement that I was running for mayor, and that person dropped out. And then I was still not the establishment's candidate. They went and asked a whole lot of people to run before they found someone who did. And I came in 5th behind a Christian nationalist.
But I think that experience, just to dive a little deeper into that, it's the difference between being an individual contributor and an individual, contribution to change versus building collective power, right? And I think you being on city council and having that position and navigating that space and all of the work that comes in it to get ready for votes, to understand some of the dynamics and some of the people, that is your community at that point, right? That's the community you're talking to, and that's the community you're navigating, and those are the things you're organizing within. That's not translating to collective community power building and organizing. And I think that's the missing piece that we have in Fort Worth and Tarrant County, is that people will get to that space. They'll get to that executive position, or they'll get to that institutional role that is very impactful, but then all of their time and effort is around that elite exclusive community and space, and there's nothing being done to build community power and community base to the scale and scope that we
that's
need.
necessary. Yes.
Right.
I would say that I exhausted myself for 7 years because I tried to do both of those things. And I am now watching some of the stuff that I felt like I got kind of built get undone by folks that are in the seats now. So that's exhausting as well.
A good example is like how elected officials communicate to organizers and to community as a whole. There's a reason that things can be more effective in some places than others, and it can get tied down to how accessible is an elected official to folks like myself and folks in the community who come to voice complaints and to voice issues and to advocate about certain things. If those doors are closed by an elected official, then we're not building power. We're not able to put things into an offensive space because they are then just focused on what their individual contribution can be. And in Tarrant County,
they speak for the people without having spoken to the people.
In Tarrant County, we are that is the mode of leadership. That now I'm at the seat, so then I'm the one who can help influence this change. A lot of times when people run for office, they're like, we just need a leader. We just need someone who can make decisions. And it's like, no, that's not how this works.
You need someone who listens to people.
You need an organizer in this space. You need someone who thinks about power. You need someone who thinks about networks and influence and things like that. And if you think you're an individual
Change
voice
maker.
is going to do that, like, it's not designed for that to happen. And we still see and that's kind of a saviorism model of leadership versus a servant-based leadership, which is trying to bring the people together to be able to accomplish this thing. And I can't even use my entire hand to count all the elected officials in Tarrant County who navigate their position and community in the way that we need it versus this model that is not working.
Because that's what I was going to say, is that I feel like it'd be interested to know what you think about city council, but like it got younger, it's more diverse. Is it argued to say that Fort Worth City Council is more progressive than it was when you were there? And then also, I don't know what the history is. Is it most progressive that it's ever been? Like, what are we giving the current landscape of our city council? I do wonder if these 10 and 11s actually, the 10 and 11 seat, did that make it a tougher dynamic?
I mean, anything
or better.
When you look at governance and when we look at government entities, the individual players, it's great to look at, but it's about the result of the collective. And I think if we look at the results of the collective
today, it's the other way. It's going backwards.
Yeah, it's going backwards.
Yeah.
And so we are still not leveraging this diversity, or even if there's individually more progressives on the city council, which I don't know the answer to that question. But even if, let's say it's true that there's more individual progressives on the city council versus in the past, at the end, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the entity itself is going to move things forward. And then the institution of the government of the city of Fort Worth is going to move things forward that are either going to move us in a positive direction or not. And so that just continues to elevate that individual contribution is not enough, right? That individual excellence is not enough. It has to be centered around how are we building collective power. And that's something that we have not strived for in Tarrant County nearly enough. And I talk to organizations and organizers across the state of Texas. I see what folks are doing in Harris County and Williamson County and Travis and the RGV. I talk to folks outside of Texas and see all of the different ways that they're navigating this space. How Virginia was able to flip their state legislature and are still navigating some of those things to sustain it, right? We're still talking about it from a defensive perspective. How we stop extremism. We're still not even in the space of being on the offensive.
My bad, man.
To be able to push forward things, right? Yeah. So when you look at it from that perspective, we still have so many more steps to go. And this is why when people are in positions of privilege and they're feeling comfortable, or they feel like they can navigate, or things are frustrating, but I'm still going to center all my time and resources on, these networking events or these galas or all this kind of stuff. Like, you're not getting it. Yeah. We are so far behind right now, and we can catch up and make up ground pretty quickly, but it's got to be a shift in intentionality. It's got to be a shift in thinking and how we go about doing that.
I think that's a great ending of this extensive interview. I'm hoping to have more with you. Continue to do the work, and thank you for coming on the panel.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.